Bloody Christmas is a 2022 horror movie about a military robot that has been repurposed to be a Toy Story Santa, and it goes on a rampage. Now, normally I'd probably dig into this story maybe a little bit deeper here, but I mean, there really isn't any reason to. I mean, that's kind of it. Like, we're introduced to Tori, who owns a record store, and her and her coworker Robbie decide to go get a drink at a local bar. On the way there, they pass by their two friends that work at a local toy store where one of these Santas happens to be. That Santa comes to life and chases Tori wherever she goes. That's really it. There's no twists or turns, reveals, there's no additional story points, there's no revelations, there's no big character moments. It's exactly what the trailer shows you it to be. Like, they don't really explain too much about the Santa exactly as to how it went bad. It just sort of goes bad for reasons. It just attacks people because it sees them, I guess. It chases Tori because it saw her. It comes alive. It kills a bunch of people in gross ways. The end. Let's start with the good. For a movie like this, I always get worried about the acting because, sometimes the care is not quite put into this element. They focus a lot more on the kills, and the casting kind of gets thrown by the wayside. But I have to give them credit. Here, that's not the case. I thought the acting was quite good. Each actor makes the most of the character that they have, despite the fact that most of the characters themselves are pretty one-dimensional. But each character is who they are, and yet the actors kind of nail it. That sounds like a pretty easy thing to do, but it's really not, and I give them a lot of credit for that. And to go along with that, the dialogue is something I got to give a little love to. Now, it seems like the writer went the extra mile to make the interactions between these people seem realistic in a way where they actually do feel like friends, and it 100% achieves that. Now, the one problem I did have with the dialogue is it leans pretty heavily into that quippy, kind of fast-talking banter speech, and I think it does it a little bit too much. It's sort of like if Kevin Smith and Aaron Sorkin had a baby, this is the type of dialogue they would write.
You were like pissing on a playground?
I didn't know the kid was gonna show up like
that. Fucking the kid was his grandson.
Yeah, I made him a man.
That's Fox. You took that away from Monroe.
I know.
You took it away from
it. It can be fun at times, but they also use it way too much. And so after a while of hearing, conversation loop of quippy banter over and over again for like 5-10 minutes, it gets a little tiring, and it's like, okay, let's move on here. Nobody is this fast on their feet in a conversation, and in this movie it seems like everyone is. As far as the special effects, also top notch. They do a really good job with what they have. I mean, it seems like most of it's done here practically, and that's pretty great. A lot of kills are fairly over the top, as you would imagine and want for this type of a movie. But even as sort of the robot element starts to poke out more and more, they seem to stick with the practical. They don't really immediately go into CGI nonsense. And it shows that they do a solid job of it. And there's a lot of care and attention put into the special effects, both in the blood work and also in just the actual special effects in the movie itself. Now, I gotta talk about the colored lights in this movie. To say the colored lights in this movie are aggressive is putting it mildly. Now, I don't mind sort of flavoring your scene with colored lights if it's done sort of here and there, but when every scene has the same style of overbearing lights, and it's kind of like the dialogue thing, where it just sort of gets exhausting after a while. And then you end up kind of losing its ability to make locations separate and memorable. The movie starts in a record store with a bunch of blue, green, and red lights. And you can kind of see that because it's portrayed as a bit kind of like a hipstery, cool kind of record store. So, okay, understandable. Got no problem with that. But then they walk down the street and they walk to a toy store, which has blue, green, and red lights. And then they leave the toy store and they go into a bar, which has red, blue, and green lights. They leave the bar and go to their car, which has got red, blue, and green lights. They go back to her apartment, which strangely enough has blue, green, and red lights, as well as their neighbor's house, which has green, blue, and red lights. Now, I get this is a Christmas-themed movie, and I understand that you're trying to put this across, but man, after a while, every goddamn location just feels like the exact same. It doesn't feel like you're going anywhere because they're all lit the exact same, and none of them are memorable in any way, shape, or form. The other thing I want to talk about is the references or the nods this movie has to previous films. So this movie is clearly an homage to Terminator or some of those old 80s movies like Silent Night, Deadly Night. But let's just talk about homages for a second. I think there's a fine line between an homage and Chris Farley in an SNL skit.
You remember when you asked him if he remembered when he said, "I'll be back" in both Terminators?
Yeah?
That was great.
Homages should be a nod to something that inspired the idea as a way of acknowledging the genesis of it. If it's just a copy and paste, in my opinion, what's the point? And I feel the same way about all the sort of remakes and reboots that you see out now. If you can't improve it or come at it from a different angle than the original, then why bother doing it in the first place? So Spielberg and Lucas famously made Raiders of the Lost Ark as an homage to those old 40s adventure serials that they grew up with. But they didn't just make an exact copy of it. What they did was they took the things that they loved about those old serials, the adventure part, the cliffhangers, the excitement, and then encapsulated that feeling that they got watching them and made a completely different movie. So sure, if you watch the movie, you can see the nods and you can see, the similar shots and setups and styles. But the movie that they made is a separate thing that you can see is built beyond that. You don't need to have seen those old movies in order to appreciate the new one. There are too many movies today that are nodding to these 80s movies that you need to have seen those movies to appreciate the current one. The movies in the 80s are revered so much today because they were a crazy time in Hollywood and the film industry just in general. There was blood in the water because of massive amounts of money coming in from blockbusters. There was the whole unshackling of the studios and the infancy of independent film. Money was being made hand over fist, and they were throwing it around in the craziest coke-fueled ways, experimenting and seeing what worked and what didn't. I mean, they tried insane ideas, took huge swings, huge risks, huge gambles. Some worked, some didn't. Certainly there were copycat movies, and they definitely tried to replicate successful films. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what came across was the attitude of innovation, experimentation, exploitation, and in some cases, just plain insanity that made those movies so memorable. That's what movies today should be copying and paying homage to, not the kitschy commercials or the neon colors or the robot Santa that chases people around like a Terminator, complete with a bastardized version of the score, a police station attack, and chasing around the female lead on the floor in the final fight. The problem here is this movie only works if you know those other better movies that it's riffing off of. I'm always of the opinion of make something that stands on its own feet without having to know anything else. It makes it that much better when a person discovers what it was that inspired you to make this in the first place. I would give this movie a C, but let me know what you think.